Hello, and welcome to Morgan Meets the Eye. My name is Evan Morgan, and I'm the host of this series. So first things first, I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I do want to encourage you to follow me on social media. My Twitter handle is at @NotSpicedRum, and my Instagram handle is at @SomeGuyNamedMorgan. So make sure to subscribe to my YouTube page, and certainly keep up with this show on Apple, Spotify, or upon whichever streaming platforms it's available. So I'm joined by a very special guest today. I'm speaking with the one and only Tho Bishop, perhaps best known for his involvement with the Mises Institute. Bishop is the Mises Institute's Editorial and Content Manager and co-hosts the podcast Radio Rothbard. In addition to this, he has written and lectured extensively about a wide array of academic subjects, many of which I hope to discuss with him here today. So thanks for coming on the show, Tho, and where can my listeners go to check out your work?
Yes, most of my work is at mises.org, so that's mises.org. I'm also active at Twitter, at Tho Bishop. Good thing a name like Tho is that you don't have to compete with lots of other people with that handle. So just at Tho Bishop there on Twitter or X or whatever it's called these days.
Nice. So before we get into anything else, though, I do want to start by, I want to point out that I'm somebody who, follows the Mises Institute very closely. And you're actually the first scholar from this institute to actually appear on this program, hopefully the first of many. But I'm just curious, what has your experience been working at the Mises Institute? I would certainly consider it to be the foremost libertarian institution that there is. Sorry, Fee. But I do think it has done a great deal to advance, these ideas to a wider audience. But I'm curious what you think this institute has accomplished in the 40 years since it was originally founded.
I think it's been an honor to be able to have that affiliation for some time now. I'm working remotely these days, but still being able to get there to Auburn and step on that campus and our beautiful building. I mean, it's a special place. I mean, there's real magic with the building, the institute, the people there. That again, it's been a great privilege and an honor to be able to be affiliated with them. And the main purpose of the Mises Institute, since it was founded, was to keep alive the torch of liberty, and particularly the works of Ludwig von Mises, of Murray Rothbard, who was one of the founders with Lew Rockwell, and keeping their ideas in print, keeping generations of scholars engaging with their work, building on their work, popularizing their work. And I think that you can see the way the world is now, while we are certainly far away from a libertarian society or Ancapistan or some of the broader political projects, I think the Mises Institute has been unquestionably successful at its mission. More people read the works of Mises and Rothbard and other Austrians today than when those men were alive. Even our critics have to engage with Austrian economics, even if it's dismissively. The awareness of this heterodox school of thought has been successfully, I think, brought back into prominence, and it's very exciting to see new generations of students and activists, whether it's in the United States or abroad. Javier Milei in Argentina, who by all intents and purposes is the leading candidate for president there, is an Austrian economist who came across these ideas because of the Mises Institute and the like. So it is it's been an honor to be able to be with an organization like that. And I think our successes are many out there, even if we may still be fighting a lot of the same battles politically that men like Mises and Rothbard were doing many decades ago.
Very powerfully said. And I've noticed that some people might hear the name of the Mises Institute and they might assume that it was founded by Ludwig von Mises himself. But in reality, this institution was established almost a decade after his death. So in fact, from the research that I've done personally on libertarian think tanks and organizations and the like, that are active globally, I've noticed that virtually all of them, maybe with the exception of FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, these were founded after Mises' death. So over the past 50 years or so, there seems to be a distinct tendency of right-wing libertarians to unify towards a kind of common goal, and whether it be through the Mises Institute, the Cato Institute, the Reason Foundation, or etc. It's just that I personally have my own theory about why this trend is happening, and it's that if we look at the early 1970s, around the same time that Ludwig von Mises died, this is where we see money essentially implode. because this is when Richard Nixon, took the U.S. off of the gold standard, and with the United States being this massive, influential superpower that it was at that time, and continues to be, uh, nation after nation really followed suit there. And sure enough, we now live in a world where the planet's entire money supply is tied to nothing, quite frankly. I mean, this is something which has had a very perceptible impact on just our own daily standard of living. So as far as I'm concerned, one of history's greatest tragedies, actually, ironically, is that Richard Nixon's biggest failure as president is considered to be the Watergate scandal, when I would say taking America off of the gold standard should be considered, much worse. But unfortunately, as we know, the average person's priorities are very much out of order. So, anyway, what I'm saying here is that I believe we've seen an unprecedented rallying together of libertarians in response, to this unprecedented shift towards authoritarianism. So I'm just curious, would you agree that organizations and academic institutions devoted to capitalism and free market principles are arising out of necessity, that is, because they have to, or would you attribute it to something else that's not quite as urgent?
I think there's definitely some truth to that reaction to times. If we look at prior to the 1970s, you saw a big movement in the 1930s and 40s, going into the 1950s, of similar libertarian-ish, maybe proto-libertarian might be the more accurate way of saying it, organizations arise to promote the works of Mises and F.A. Hayek and the like. And that was in response to New Deal policies and the growing statism of FDR America and kind of its continuation thereon after. And so, that was definitely a moment, sparked a reaction. Of course, then you had a lot more corporate support. F.A. Hayek's Road to Serfdom was actually distributed in kind of an abbreviated form by General Motors. And you can't even imagine a company like that doing anything similar like that today. I think the Cato Institute, though, is kind of an interesting example of the growth of the libertarian philosophy as a political movement broadly, which Murray Rothbard played a major role in, where kind of this very dedicated anti-statist political worldview, rising not just obviously from the work of Rothbard, but you could think about Ayn Rand's contributions and popularization with her works. You had a variety, Isabel Patterson, you had a variety of thinkers really creating, distinctly from, say, the conservative intellectual movement, a very anti-state philosophy. And I think Cato was really a building block from that, helped, no doubt, by the money issue. But I think you actually saw kind of a birth even predating 1971 that led to this birth of a libertarian idea that needed institutions to arise. Obviously, the role that the Koch brothers played as financiers in this, which has some contention later on with personal fractions kind of breaking down there. But I think that played a role there. There were some earlier institutions. Institute for Humane Studies by Baldy Harper was another one that's kind of within that old right tradition. And then recently, I think, while the Mises Institute itself was kind of formed in some ways as a reaction to concerns about changing priorities of the Cato Institute, particularly kind of moving away from Austrian economics as we promote. I think you definitely saw, in the 2008, 2009, 2010 Tea Party sort of reaction to the financial crisis, the reaction to Obamacare and the like. You saw another massive lift up of a variety of libertarian organizations that exploded onto the map. Again, often funded by Koch money there as well. But that's another example where a period in time, a political dynamic, sparked the building up of institutions. Now, some of them have not, I think, aged particularly well. A lot of them, I think you see a boom and bust of political investment the same way that you might see in the economy here and there. And so a lot of those Tea Party era movements are either shells of their former selves or went out consolidated, again, particularly within the Koch network. But I think you're right that the reaction to periods of economic hardship, of political instability, ends up creating a spark that ignites movements and institutions that are necessary to promote movements as a reaction there. And I think that you're seeing now, Bitcoin and everything that's formed around the ecosystem of Bitcoin, that itself is a response to the financial crisis of 2008. And I think it continues to have life because of our continuing fears of the costs and consequences of fiat politicized money. And so, you see pockets there as well, globally, where you get people realizing the really extent to which we're in very uncertain financial times, a lot more awareness of what government has done to our money, to use Rothbard's title, and seeing that spark a variety of investments, both in the nonprofit sector, but also, and I think most encouragingly, within the private sector, of real use cases to respond to these concerns.
Right, very well said there. Yes, yes, I would certainly agree. And as far as the whole libertarian movement, as far as libertarian organization towards some type of a common goal, I'm a firm believer in the idea that no man is an island, and that in order for us to build a functioning libertarian economy, we do have to cooperate with each other and unite towards some type of agreed upon goal. And this principle doesn't only apply to libertarian think tanks and institutions, obviously, but also to the market itself, the free market. And Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations actually opens by addressing the very division of labor, explaining that work is most efficiently performed when each individual in the production line works at the specific task that he is best suited for. I know the famous essay I Pencil alludes to this whole concept as well, as far as different actors and different places all around the world are all working together just to create one individual pencil. But anyway, I've noticed that the collectivists have essentially taken this idea of teamwork and cooperation and the idea of no man is an island, and they've completely distorted it in a sense. They've really weaponized the very nature of social transaction itself, in other words. I would say that socialists tend to treat a functioning free market's dependence on solidarity and teamwork as some kind of a gotcha situation, so to speak. What I mean here is that this is really a deep misunderstanding of capitalism and libertarianism as concepts. So they'll act as though cooperation between actors in a marketplace is some kind of concession towards collectivism. But what they fail to understand is that this cooperation has to be voluntary, on the level of the individual. We need to have freedom of association, in other words, this is to say, which these statists don't really understand here. But what I'm saying here is that, just to illustrate this point, in my personal life, for example, I've gotten into plenty of arguments with collectivists. Socialists have argued with me that, essentially, even though I espouse individualism, I cannot be an individualist because I live in a society. They'll tell me that because I live in a society, someone else's problems are my problems and vice versa. To which I say, no. Someone else's problems do not become my problem until a third party, such as the state, steps in to make them my problem. So, these same people will give me these false ultimatums as either carry your burden of social problems or just go live on an island and do everything for yourself if you're such an individualist. And I mean, this is what these people actually do tell me, but this is not how free market exchange built upon, a person's individual subjective valuations works. The issue here is that a lot of these collectivists will make statements such as this that might sound nice on the surface, but they're really just empty rhetoric when you actually examine their ideas. So someone else's problems are not my problems. What I'm saying here is that, for example, if someone doesn't have a car, that has no bearing on whether or not I have a car. Now, if someone has a problem, this is synonymous with saying that that same individual has a demand. So let's say that they demand a car then. Now, let's say that I have a problem or demand in that I need money to purchase a house. So I just want to emphasize here that my problem of not having money for a house and this other person's problem of not having transportation are not the same problem. I can sell cars in exchange for the money that I would need to pay for this house, and this person can get the car they seek out of this transaction. So doing this would help us with our own individual problems, but nowhere along this line have either of us forced the other to carry the burden of our own problems, of our own respective problems. So anyway, I hope you'll forgive me if I'm being a bit long-winded here, but I'm kind of just curious how you would respond to people who try to push these collectivist and inherently anti-Austrian arguments that that tend to sort of blur the line between individualism and collectivism.
So it's a real perversion of what I think Mises illustrates quite beautifully within his work on the importance, that the real liberal in a libertarian sense goal is peaceful social cooperation, and the marketplace provides for that network, that wonderful, incredible global network of working within the division of labor, the production of real goods and services that satisfy individual wants and needs. There is something, from a certain sense, there's a collectivist dynamic there where, we need the services of other human beings, right? We are inherently social creatures, and the market provides for the ability for us to voluntarily arrange ourselves so that we can, benefit by being productive, right? You have to produce to be a part of this, within this broader global sense of civilization. Of course, the fundamental dynamic, as you alluded to, is this distinction between the market and the state, liberty versus power. And Murray Rothbard, writing his economic histories, which I think are some of his greatest work, he has this wonderful historical framework where he looks at the history of mankind, right, through this lens of liberty versus power. And I think that dynamic, there are areas where I think certain types of libertarian arguments and rhetoric can perhaps feed the idea of sort of a selfish libertarianism. You can extrapolate, and you can I think misrepresent Ayn Rand in particular, with her sort of ego focus, which I personally am a fan of. I personally came into libertarianism a great deal because of her work, but I understand how people can distort her sort of selfishness as a virtue sort of framework to derive from that and pull from that this sort of caricature of a purely self-interested individual who does not care about the well-being of others. I think that's a misperception there. That's a distortion. But I can understand why some people could, on good faith, not understand that we do recognize the importance of this community. And I think, again, understanding the difference between the brutality of the state versus peaceful cooperation is important. And unfortunately, as you also mentioned, the left has picked up, I think, has distorted this dynamic at a real important level when it comes to the economy. While America, in the West broadly, we still have, a very robust, nominally private sector when it comes to economy, going back to, the abolishment of any gold backing and currency. What we have is the socialization of money by the state, which has also led to this broader financialization of the economy, where the favorite financial institutions, the largest banks, for example, that play an active role in monetary policy, that have the state privileges that come with a fiat money regime, they are able to have a significant say into what are the industries that are the biggest benefactors, the first benefactors of newly created money and credit, which creates this very much this patronage system where the state, not by direct nationalization and control, can end up dictate market outcomes out there that we as consumers have to, you can only have choices of the market that are provided by the marketplace. You can't have, if you want a car, you're going to have to deal with what is available in the lot. You can't have the ideal car manufactured in front of you, not without paying a whole lot of money for something that custom. And so as the larger marketplace, as capital itself is distorted within these state patronized institutions, I think we are seeing some very real control, a lot of centralization with economic planning that is not coming from the traditional socialist sense, but is stemming from this financialized aspect. And so the left has been very good. This is why we have the concerns over, ESG programs and sort of this larger woke capital, this sort of World Economic Forum style control over capital markets and large financial institutions, because ultimately, if they control where credit and money goes to the largest levels, it's going to impact the markets, the items, the production goods that are out there for us to choose from. And if they have an ideological agenda they want to attach to that, that's going to be reflected with what we have in this hampered state-controlled, state-regulated marketplace. And I think what our problem is as libertarians is that we have to recognize that the biggest threats to our liberty are not just the state itself in a narrow dynamic, but also these state-privileged large financial institutions and corporations. And be able to defend our position that, ultimately, this comes back to money, this comes back to the state, this comes back to the regulatory state, and that, this is the evil that needs to be purged, while also not kind of allowing for this sort of accepted dynamic of the government sort of privatizing their most tyrannical functions, and to pretend that this is an example of the marketplace at work. And unfortunately, we have seen some sort of libertarian groups out there, I think COVID being one of the great examples of it, where they were kind of falling, either they were defending corporate tyranny that was backed by the state, while not addressing the state aspect leading to these corporate decisions. And I think this is one of the things where as the left has become more sophisticated, as the economy has, we were fighting a different battle than Mises was, when he was, identifying the economic possibility of socialism as a truly state-controlled, controlled economy. We're dealing with a very different breed. It's a more difficult breed in some sense, but the underlying solutions are the same: allow the marketplace to operate properly. And first and foremost, that comes down to depoliticizing money and credit, as the, and everything that comes with that.
There seems to definitely be a tendency I've noticed, as far as communicating this division between capitalism and socialism, there is a tendency for the capitalist to almost be portrayed as the defender of the status quo. I remember back when I was in college, for example, I leaned a lot more towards socialism than I do now. Based upon my, when I was growing up, the whole representation of politics was, the left wants change, the right wants everything to stay the same, which I think is an extremely oversimplified and it really lacks nuance as far as, how complex the situation is. So I noticed that when a lot of people would, propose these socialist ideas, such as, universal health care or things like that, and you'd have, people arguing against them with capitalism, from that perspective, in that time of my life, I kind of saw that as the capitalists almost arguing for, the status quo. When in reality, I don't think, and, I think some capitalists do a bad job of communicating, capitalism. Obviously not all, but a small, minority of them, I think, do have a tendency to come across as though they don't spend enough time calling out the corporatist aspect of the society that we live in currently. And it wasn't until I started reading, the Austrian economists that it really clicked to me, and I realized, the value of getting the state out of the economy, and how that, stifles the free market process. The socialists will take, a very rough, brazen method of doing things. They'll propose just, there's so much poverty, let's just take money from the wealthy and give it to the poor. When in reality, it's much more of a nuanced situation than that. I would say that if for example, if we just took billions of dollars away, from, let's say, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or some of the wealthier people in society, it's not as simple as you're just going to take their money and then you're going to give it all to the poor, and that society will continue running as smoothly as it did originally. There's going to be, obviously, peripheral effects caused by that. So I'm curious what you think would be, what if this is a more, gritty, a more wild and, careless approach to, fixing the economic problems that we face today. What do you think would be a more delicate and, logical way of handling it?
I think it ultimately comes from an emphasis on money and banking. Until we address the financialization of the economy, then we're going to be playing a game that is fundamentally rigged against us, because you do have that dynamic where, throughout history, if we look beyond kind of simply socialist economies, you've always had a class of merchants, of trade associations that have benefited from the patronage of the crown. So if you look at the history of revolution, the history of liberalism, it's not simply the business class kind of as a homogenous blob that has been the advocates for free markets or capitalism or whatever word you preferred. It has been in particular, the small business class. It's been that bourgeoisie. It's been the group of people right in the middle. They are not the poor that are looking for free bread and handouts. They are not the ones that have, that they're not the ones in the aristocracy that benefit from, being in the good graces of power. It's those in the middle that are perhaps seeking to have those good graces, and like, they are looking for their own upward mobility to, be within the power elite, if you will. And I think ultimately that is the area that we need to, that is our demographic in terms of preaching, and evangelizing the proper ideas for a stable civilization for them and their family, that can be mobilized into an effective unit against the powers at be that exist. And that is what the market does. If you are a powerful company, if you're a powerful economic family now, in order to maintain that level of prestige within the market economy, you have to constantly be producing value, in the future, to be able to maintain that prominence. What we have right now is a system where, again, if you look at, the consequences of Federal Reserve policy and the like, right? The biggest benefactors in recent history have been, the financial class. It's been the wealth managers, not the wealth creators. It has been, if you were invested in financial assets during the Obama years, for example, you saw a tremendous increase in your net wealth. We saw it again during COVID. We shut down firms, we shut down jobs, we locked people in their homes, and yet the biggest, most powerful companies out there, Amazon and various tech companies alike, that could, kind of play right into the lockdown political agenda, they made billions. I mean, it was a great wealth transfer to the most politically powerful at the expense of small business owners. And it's ironic, of course, the left, who tries to present themselves as the enemies of the 1%. It is ultimately their ideas up to a point, right? I don't think Jeff Bezos wants a full socialist revolution and guillotines. I don't think he's comfortable on where he would lie, if it came to that. But they are perfectly fine with this interventionist system that we've had for a very long time, that continues to grow. So again, the more decisions that are litigated, or the more that your economic well-being comes from the decisions of regulators and large financial institutions rather than the products of the market itself, that is going to benefit those that can afford to have the various campaign contributions, lobbyists groups and the like. Those decisions are going to more often than not stack in your favor. So I guess this goes back to this dynamic of liberty versus power, where you have an oligarch class that will continue to be on the right side of power, particularly if they follow the regime's wishes on a variety, whatever their ideology, whatever the religion of the regime is at the time. If they play lockstep within that agenda, then they are going to be on a good side. It's that middle class that I think is the natural allies for liberty and political change. And I think, if you look throughout the history of, even the personal biographies of people like Mises and Rothbard, where they have been able to benefit from their own patrons, it comes from that class of people that are upset and looking to have a political change. And that's ultimately where I think the organization that we need to fight back against the system that is rigged against us. We need people within that fold that are willing to take on those battles. And the really scary thing is that the tools that have been created are very effective, right? The ability to, if you come out too hard against the regime, they can attack you financially. They can attack you in ways that can, destroy your business, that can create, a massive legal burden on you. The regime is very powerful. And that is the where the real dynamic is right now. And you see it with, see it the way that they're treating Elon Musk now, that he has, become more of a thorn in the side of the average Washington politico, rather than, being someone happy to build electric cars for the Obama administration. Look at the way that Peter Thiel is depicted in the media, since he has voiced his own skepticism of the current regime. Those are the people they want to destroy, precisely because they are not happy with the direction of the political power structure as it currently exists.
Yes, what you're saying actually kind of calls to mind a fairly, infamous video of, Peter Schiff speaking to some protesters from the Occupy Wall Street movement, and him telling them, the very same goals that they're seeking could be achieved by actually implementing less government rather than more. But there seems to be this type of backwards notion that I would say a lot of leftist ideals have really instilled into many unsuspecting members of the public. But shifting this, from a philosophical conversation to more of a hard economics discussion, I recently heard, Nina Turner, in her infamous stupidity, state that the solution to poverty is money. So there are many different rebuttals to this idea that can be used against this, but statements such as this really demonstrate how unrefined so many people on the left's understanding of economics really is. So if we were to break this down, for example, Nina here would be saying that the solution to a lack of material goods, is a medium of exchange that is actually used to obtain these goods in the first place. So what if the people who own those goods have no incentive to exchange them with people who don't have them because they no longer see the medium of exchange as the valuable item that they once did? I mean, my question to Nina Turner is that if the solution to poverty is money, then what's the solution to inflation? But anyway, though, my question to you is, what is your rebuttal to this idea idea that the solution to poverty is money, and what is the reasoning behind your rebuttal, that you would use against these Keynesian or Marxist or just simply erroneous policies that Nina Turner and a lot of people similar to her are advocating? What knowledge would you like them and their followers to learn regarding economics?
Well, I think it'd be wrong to kind of lump Nina Turner in sort of a Keynesian pool, or try to give her any sort of the credit of having any sort of broader sort of economic perspective of the world, with perhaps the exception of maybe modern monetary theory, which I doubt she has read in any great deal too. But I think modern monetary theory, which is the idea that that the government can basically print and spend money at their will, without real consequences, because they have taxing power and the like, and that they can use this as a policy tool. I think we got a great taste of that during the COVID era, where there was a complete lack of regard for the production aspect of the economy and a great deal of focus on monetary stimulus and the like. And you had Trump bucks, and you had Biden's round of checks and things like that. And what people experienced was, it was the highest levels of inflation that America had had in quite some time and within generations. That's the problem, though, is that if you, in my experience, if you engage with the left, their focus is on redistribution, which I can understand to a certain extent, but they have no idea, they have no concept of the productive aspect of things. They don't have any interest in exploring the question of what creates prosperity in its own right. What they're interested in is looking at, if we think about all goods and services as some sort of homogeneous blob, what's the best way to redistribute the shares of that so that each individual has a more equal outcome of that pie? They have no, and of course, this just comes from a complete ignorance, of what the entire process it takes to be able to have the cars and food and clothing and all these things that we're really looking for when we talk about, when they are, what they are talking about, when they are looking for, increasing the quality of life for, whatever their group that they're trying to advocate for. And I think really this kind of comes down to, one of the great tragedies of the modern world is the poor way that economics is taught in high schools. We're living really in an age of, I think, economic agnosticism, of economic denialism. And I think that, part of that comes from the fact that the most prominent economic voices out there have been wrong, right? When Peter Schiff was right, Paul Krugman and most of the economic punditry class was wrong. You see the economics profession has been discredited, rightfully so, within the mainstream, for their inability to predict obvious crises from happening. And that creates kind of this perspective, I think, that permeates within both the left and I think increasingly the right, that views economics as a discipline really as sort of a propaganda platform pushed by some sort of group they don't like. So the left sees economics as a propaganda platform by big corporate special interest groups, right? Those evil Koch brothers, that use the mantle of free markets to simply convince politicians to give them more money so that they can go live off yachts and the like. On the right, you see economics increasingly kind of seen and dismissed as a tool of corporations, or of corporations as well, that for things that they are increasingly identifying as bad. You think about defenses of deplatforming conservatives on social media and the like. There's been the lack of any sort of serious economic lens by which otherwise intelligent people view the world. I think if you don't have that lens of just understanding the basics of trade-offs, understanding the opportunity costs, appreciating the entire stage of production necessary for the production of things. And we think about the eye-pencil dynamic of just the amount of different actors that are needed to pull together to create simple things. If you don't have that basic lens to add to your understanding of the world at large, it is very easy to kind of create from thin air all these outlandish, impractical things. And unfortunately, what economics really is, I believe is a quote by F.A. Hayek, is that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they know about what they imagine they can design. The real role of economics should be telling people what they can't do, which is not a very popular thing, right? If you're a good economist, you're not going to be well liked by the political class. And I think that that incentive mechanism by people wanting to be liked, wanting to have a very nice position, wanting to have, it leads to ignoring the real economic consequences of things. And that's why you have right now a political system where both political parties are perfectly fine kicking the can down the road on an outrageous debt levels for America, completely disinterested in dealing with the real issues behind money. They're completely content on ignoring these issues that have no simple political solutions. And again, when the proper solution to an economic crisis is to allow it to play out, to allow prices to fall, to allow for businesses to go out of work because they were artificially propped up, to allow wages to fall. These are all dynamics that the solution requires real hardship for people, right? If you are in an industry, if you were a home builder in the financial crisis, if you were a realtor during the housing bust, you dealt with very real pain that you had you were not responsible for the low interest rates that inflated the bubble. You were not responsible for the policy things that led you to take on these careers, this direction of your life. You were not responsible for the underlying policy things that led you to this point, and yet you are the one bearing the consequences. We can't, us as a society right now, we can't stomach this, these short-term pains in order to have a better future in the future, a better future for everyone else in the long run. And I think that sort of reflexive dynamic, it makes it very difficult for certain people to really engage properly with ultimately our questions of economics. And again, unfortunately, so much of the economic mainstream is perfectly okay with promoting a lot of this delusional dynamics. And again, I think that goes to a broader conversation to the extent that incentives in research and academics and sort of this serious thinking class have been politicized its own right. The number one source for economics grants out there is the Federal Reserve. It's surprise, surprise. The sort of research you get out there tends to be in their favor and the like. So we have this additional dynamic where the state has perverted, institutes of higher learning that would otherwise kind of deal with some of these issues. But it's a very real problem. I think economic denialism is one of the great cultural and social issues that we have, and ultimately there's no solution besides education, and that's one of the main focuses the Mises Institute has within its mission, is to help spread the ideas with books and articles and podcasts and other sort of content, so at the very least we can create a remnant of people that are capable of looking at the world around us and thinking about it like an economist, and to have that additional sort of lens to avoid being bamboozled by the outlandish schemes, propagandas, and lies from the political class and those that are the conspirators.
In fact, what you're saying, basically as far as economics in itself as a science being discredited, I've seen that, quite a lot. I've seen it from people, on the left as well. I've seen socialists and Marxists saying that they see economics itself as a pseudoscience. I would say, maybe your particular branch of economics is a pseudoscience, but I don't look at Austrian economics, obviously, in that same light. Uh, but Tho, I do know that you edited the book, Anatomy of the Crash, a book that was published very early on during the COVID pandemic. And that book made some very profound observations and some grim warnings about the future due to the state's monetary policy. This book, seems to be getting proven a lot more and more prophetic every day at this rate. And I know that, NASDAQ reports that the nation's money supply actually increased by a total of 27%, if I'm not mistaken, as a response to COVID. Now, in 2023, it's been over 3 years since then. Has your perspective on this, matter changed, or do you think it's only, deepened in regards to the government's response to COVID?
Well, I think it's definitely deepened. Again, in order to understand where the economy is now, we can't simply start with the interventions that we saw during COVID, which took a lot of what the Fed has done since 2008, really, and brought it into hyperdrive. I think an understanding of, I think one of the important things that we have to do when we have these sort of conversations is, and sometimes this could be difficult, right? Because if we're, if we want to critique back to 1971 and the closing of the golden window, if we want to go back to the 1930s and talk about the FDR's confiscation of gold, right? There's been this drumbeat for over 100 years of this gradual state control over money and banking, and all of it needs to be condemned. All of it has brought us to this point, but to really understand just the extent to which post 2008 Federal Reserve policy is so historically, which, and this seems very long living in this moment, right? And we're now talking about 13, 14 years of this, and as a human being occupying that space and time, that seems like a very long time. But in the grand scope of human history, what has been going on since 2008 is completely unprecedented, with the extent to which central banks have allowed governments to just, massively expand their debts. I mean, we're dealing with the global debt bubble out there, the way that low interest rates incentivized, I think one of the ways that I try to explain it to people to understand it is that when you lower interest rates, you're subsidizing risk within the system. It's a risk subsidization tool. And so what we have is a total financial system that has been subsidized to take on risk. And now that we're in a point where interest rates have had to go up in order to deal with the inflationary pressures that COVID in particular spurred on, that is where the policymakers are now in a decision where, they are having to raise interest rates. You're seeing all these cracks in the armor created by, what had been a previous period of risk subsidization. We saw early issues earlier this year with regional banks dealing with bad debt that they have. We're seeing corporate defaults increase dramatically across the board. You're seeing situations, and it's not simply a United States thing. And I think this is another area where it's easy to kind of, if you're an American libertarian, it's easy to focus on what the Fed does bad. And I think that's what's led to people, being concerned after 2008, right? Concerns then hyperinflation is going to come because of Bernanke's policies. Well, America in a global economy, right? What the Fed was doing was really, really bad, but relative to most of the rest of the world, they took it in even more extreme directions. Unfortunately, one of America's best exports has been bad economic policy. So most central bankers think the way that American central bankers do. And so if the entire globe engages in the same sort of insanity, the same sort of monetary recklessness, the impacts it's going to have in a specific part of the globe, particularly America, that has the privilege of being the global reserve currency. So our mistakes, you pee in a pool, it's different than peeing in the ocean, right? So like America has been able to have an opportunity, we were kind of immune to a lot of the major consequences of these extravagant policies until the Fed had to pivot. And I think we're going to continue to see credit events going on. I know there's a lot of people far more attuned to, the bond markets, a lot more attuned to some of the more technical aspects of financial services industry that are warning that the entire, if anyone out there thinking that the blips that we had in March and April with small banks have gone away, there's massive issues with commercial real estate loans that have largely held by regional and smaller banks because of a variety of reasons. It's not held by Wall Street banks. Um, you know, the increase of interest rates is really demonstrating how many firms out there were only able to survive because of the ability to kind of keep kicking their own debt burdens down the road, right, with refinancing and the like. And globally, you know, this increase in interest rates is causing very real stresses. So the Fed backed itself in the corner, and that's what we were trying to illustrate with that book, is that the stresses that COVID was creating in the economy are made all the worse by everything that came really since 2008. COVID was a massive, a massive new stressor, and the inflation aspects out there. We're still paying the cost for post 2008 central bank policy, and I think you could see it going on with China and some of their problems that they have going on. You see it with Europe and the stresses there. We're at an early point of dealing with the costs of what the central banks have done to us, and I think this is another reason why it's so important to be able to engage with people outside the libertarian orbit that are responding to the problems of financialization. And if you're concerned about the size of corporations, the amount of corporate consolidation you saw in that period of low interest rates, where large firms could take out debt to buy competitors and the like. Facebook was able to buy Instagram and WeChat because their debt was very cheap. They were to finance it and the like, right? So if you're concerned about corporate consolidation and various aspects of that, well, then it goes back to the Fed. If you're concerned about income inequality, it goes back to the Fed, and trying to again get various groups that are not necessarily libertarian. Their ideal might not be a free market the same way that we want, but they have different critiques with the way the current system is working. Directing them back to the problem being money and banking is, I think, a very important job right now, because ultimately, when things get rough, revolutions, more often than not, end up with a worse state of things than they do to begin with. I think in those that are able to have a good outcome, ultimately, it's what are the underlying, what are the validity of these very specific critiques of power, and what are the steps taken after that revolution has to address those critiques. And so, again, getting a focus on money and banking as a necessary part of any sort of political change that happens as a result of the stresses that normal people are having here, I think is extremely important for making sure that whatever comes next is better than what we have right now.
Right. And I noticed when we were talking there about how, what we've seen over the past 15 years or so, since 2008, is really, an unprecedented, phenomenon. And this is something that's happened, well beyond the lifetimes of, the classic Austrian thinkers such as, Rothbard, Mises, Hayek. So none of them have really gotten to witness, what's going on economically, since the 2008 crash. So what exactly, to be clear here, is the Austrian solution to this type of problem? Because obviously the problem that we're facing since then has not, been resolved. If anything, it's only gotten worse and worse. Would you advocate some type of, Ron Paul method of ending the Fed, or would there be some other type of technique that you would prescribe, in order to fixing the situation?
I think ending the Fed would be great. I have a, I think ending the Fed ultimately is a political solution. I'm skeptical of skepticism of that. I don't think Congress is going to pass a bill anytime soon that says, we're going to abolish the Federal Reserve. One thing, another policy tool that Ron Paul advocated, though, which I think is quite eloquent, is allowing for eliminating the points of privilege that the dollar has relative to other monetary competitors. So one of the bills that Ron Paul pushed would eliminate the taxes on gold, silver, and cryptocurrency that comes from capital gains and the like. And I think if you eliminated any tax burden that you had if you save in Bitcoin and Bitcoin goes up and you cash it out, there's no taxation from that transaction, then I think savings in Bitcoin would go up. Savings in gold would go up. And so I think ultimately the proper Austrian approach is to allow for a competition of money and seeing what performs best on the market. And so some of the ways this can be done is that you could work that into, say, like a tax bill that that a political party passes. If you have, let's just use a theoretical example, 2018, Republicans passed a tax bill. You had, I believe, a 52-48 Republican majority at the time. John McCain, I think, was in, he was not in D.C. I think he was still dealing with his cancer issue, and so you had essentially a one or two seat margin of error there. Marco Rubio, that gave each individual member a tremendous amount of leverage to put something in that tax bill that they wanted. Marco Rubio used that leverage effectively for his own purposes, which was to expand the child income tax credit. So if you were a family with children, you got an additional benefit because of what Marco Rubio pushed in there. If I was advising, let's say, Rand Paul at the time, then I would have advocated for precisely this tax cut, this abolishment of capital gains taxes, in order to get his vote. He did not do that. He did not ask my opinion, so that did not get done. In fact, the 2008 tax bill actually made crypto harder. It actually helped bolster some of the tax consequences on crypto transactions. But that's just an example of, if you have, let's say, 5 senators in Washington willing to make their line, look, I'm not going to support this tax cut without the elimination of capital gains taxes on alternative currencies, then you're not going to get my support. That would be something that could be done, I think, from a legislative perspective that doesn't require something as bold and ambitious as the abolishment of the Fed itself. That will not stop the moves that the Fed is taking to deal with various aspects of the dollars. It's not going to solve the fundamental problems with the Fed itself, but it would allow at least for individuals to be able to work lifeboats off of the dollar system. And I think that would be a good thing. But you do see some other examples out there. I mean, Javier Milei in Argentina, his problem is, they've got triple-digit inflation in Argentina, so he's trying to abolish the peso, and accept, they pushing for their own sort of form of competing currencies there, dollarization, which I know can seem ironic. We're bashing the dollar here, we're bashing the Fed, and yet, here you have an Austrian promoting dollarization of Argentina, just simply because dollar is better than most of the currencies out there. But there a push to abolish a central bank might actually be politically feasible, given the tremendous political unrest that you have there because of economic issues. And until America is at that similar breaking point, if we have triple-digit inflation in America, then maybe there would be an appetite to discuss even more radical reforms than what I'm proposing. But you have this dynamic where it requires a crisis to really go into the most bold and radical steps. If there's any way of creating lifeboats away before you get to that point, I think the better off we would be. And so I think that is one, I think, practical approach to help protect consumers and savers in this moment right now. But the problem is going to ultimately. So now again, that's not going to help address really, the Kantian effects of money creation. It's going to address some of those other parts. Ultimately, it's going to require a complete divorce from money and banking with the political structure in order to get to that point. But I think there's things that we can do before we get there that would help. Again, one of the things it's the forefront of my mind is what are things that can be done to help strengthen the economic health of that middle class that I mentioned earlier, so that they are stronger as individuals. Because I think ultimately, whatever movement we have fighting the federal Leviathan as it stands, we need strong families, we need strong individuals, we need prosperous, wealthy, successful individuals, we need respected individuals in order to have that sort of thing. And so again, just the same way that the left is good at making sure that their people are taken care of, they pass a major bill and it has all sorts of funding for, green activists and diversity. officers and things like that, we need to be thinking about, what are meaningful steps that we can take at the state, federal, local government that are going to reward responsible people that are interested in liberty, even if they might not have it, even if they might not be as theoretically robust as a very well-read libertarian might be, but they just have that instinctual anti-government sort of early American respect for individual rights. What are ways that we can help protect them in the short term so that their families are better off, so that they can be better to weather the storms ahead of us?
Right. Yes, I am someone who sees the wearing down of the state as more of a transitional process, whereas I know some people, I see it as more of something that should be gradual, whereas I know some people see that it should have some idea that it should be instantaneous, where I don't see that as necessarily feasible. For example, we have industries, where the government currently has a forced monopoly on so many areas, such as law enforcement, certain things like that. Now, if I just snapped my fingers and the government just went poof and disappeared, naturally that would leave a vacuum in these areas. And, as far as I'm concerned, if, a vacuum in, let's say, law enforcement or security or things like that, regardless of how brief, could have some negative consequences. Now, this is not a criticism of, Rothbardianism in any sense. It's simply, a comment on the fact that these roots of the state have gotten so deep within our society that it's kind of put us in this position where it's going to take some time to wind it back and undo the damage that it's caused. Now, I have gathered that you are, someone with an interest in history, so I think this would be a good place to kind of discuss, some of the more historical ideas, that have been taking place in regards to economics, throughout our history. And in particular, I wanted to kind of discuss, historical revisionism. So this is a concept that, the great Murray Rothbard, championed. And from a libertarian perspective, just to put it in more general, simplistic terms, historical revisionism just requires us to see history in a more objective light, rather than one that's blurred by this assumption that, governments are required in order for us to have peace or security or anything like that. This social bias towards statism, has obfuscated the truth in a lot of cases. I mean, from what I've read from Rothbard directly on this subject, which admittedly is more limited than I would like, there is this common misconception that while dictatorships are inherently prone to foreign war and aggression, democracies are supposedly the antidote to this. However, if we take Rothbard and his use of historical revisionism, this challenges this notion, because it cites plenty of cases where these dictatorships did not engage in foreign aggression because they were content to aggress against their own citizens domestically. I mean, the example that comes to mind for me personally would be, Japan prior to the mid-19th century. And, and there are also instances of these allegedly peaceful democracies, being quite hawkish. I mean, for example, the one that comes to mind for me, if we label the U.S. as a democracy, which is debatable, I mean, we could say it is a constitutional republic, but for all intents and purposes, if we were to describe it as a democracy in that sense, we can look at a contemporary example as far as the public's pushing for war with Afghanistan following 9/11. There might be a push for historians to see the American state's response to 9/11 as just or outright heroic, but once we look at it from a more historically revisionist perspective, we can poke holes in this narrative. So, like I said, my understanding on this subject is limited, and my explanation may be a bit flawed here. You know a lot more about it than I do, so how would you explain what historical revisionism is, how it relates to libertarianism, and why should people be interested in this particular type of thought?
Well, I think it just comes from appreciation of the extent to which narratives and mythos guide the way that we see the world, and so your perspective on your perspective for the future is going to be shaped by your understanding of the past. I think we even see it played out in the economic sphere, where the mainstream economists that adopt Keynesian worldviews, they have a perspective on kind of the Great Depression as one of the most formative sort of historical periods that modern economists have to navigate through. And so if your perspective on the Great Depression is that government spending, be it either from New Deal policies or from World War II, is what got America out from the Great Depression, then your perspectives on government subsidies or even horrifically war in order to address economic problems in the future are going to be changed. If you have a Rothbardian perspective that attributes the Great Depression as a result of the easy monetary policies leading up to the Great Depression, and the role that the central bank played in fostering the conditions that led to stock bubbles and the like, then your prescription is going to be very different. And then when you again take into account the institutional dynamics of increasingly politicized academic universities, the way that the ability to get research grants being dictated by the value that your research provides the state. There are all sorts. History is saturated with lies. It tends to be written in ways that glorify political power, and so therefore, in order to create a narrative that future people that we today understanding the future issues that the people in the future are going to be able to look at in today's world, you need constantly being willing to have that lens to identify the past being the far past, being in a distant past, or even the current past, with a cynical lens on the extent that the state has played to make you think that their narrative that they have benefited from is what really happened there. And Rothbard, who wrote so broadly on throughout so much of American history, everything from the American Revolution. He has a very revisionist take on the Constitution, as rather than being some document that fortified American liberty after the Revolution, was actually a coup in its own right that ended up helping further centralize power, going into the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and the like. His understanding of the Progressive era, his understanding of the Jacksonian era, his understanding of modern history, the way that Rockefellers and the Morgan family, from some of the largest oligarchs out there, the way that they had their hands in American foreign policy in the 20th century and the like, taking this revisionist lens and trying to doing real history within it. You don't just want to create a narrative that it fits your ideological point of view, but looking at the real facts of the matter, looking at the incentives, looking at these things from an economic point of view, you can derive very different history, a very different narrative, very different understanding than what you're going to get through most academic books. And the left has always been very successful at this, right? The left right now, the new left historical movement, it turned the history of the West to a history of colonialism and exploitation, and the like. And so the left has always had this sort of historical revisionist lens as in the forefront of their ideological projects. And I think that plays in the role of why they have been successful in spreading their ideas, because there's always going to be a limited number of people that are interested in going deep in terms of economic theory or political theory and the like. What they can is understand stories. And so I think that's where historical revisionism is an important aspect of education. And again, very thankful to have someone like Murray Rothbard, who provided so much work within this. Some of our younger scholars that are doing the same thing. Dr. Patrick Newman has a great book on cronyism that is kind of supplementing Rothbard's work, particularly in early America. He's got a new book coming out, kind of in, I believe, from the Mexican War up to, I think, World War II or something like that. But I think that revisionist look is very important, and you're even seeing it now. There's a fascinating book on World War II called Stalin's War that I think has really changed the conversation in terms of some of the dynamics within from the political dynamic, and particularly Soviet successes in World War II that are kind of glossed over with our understanding of the 20th century as a whole. And so again, I think revisionist history is a very important aspect of when you are on the outs, when you are a heterodox intellectual tradition, when you are creating, when you are pushing ideas that question the current political class, revisionism is a necessary tool in order to help people understand the realities of what they're facing, to try to get them closer to your ideas on what a better future would look like.
Going into some concrete examples of historical revisionism, when I first heard about this concept, the first case that actually came to mind was, if you can believe this, was actually the Irish potato famine back in the 19th century. This is I think a classic case where the account is often given that 1 million Irish people starved to death due to a plant disease that caused too little potato production. But I think this leaves out the horrible actions of the British government during this very same time. I know Tony Blair, for example, at one point was saying that he thinks it's a horrible tragedy and that he wishes the British government had done more during this time. When in reality, I would say that if anything, it's that the British government was doing too much. This is a case where, you know, the British hegemony over the Irish at that time was, very extensive. They had essentially colonized the Irish. The British had essentially seized large pieces of land, which they then, essentially hired the farmers to till the land, this land that the Irish did not actually own in the first place. And as a result, they were also selling, these, these lands to the Irish, as tenants. And due to the British government's actions, these plots of land were getting increasingly smaller and the rents were getting increasingly higher, which kept driving the Irish towards more of a subsistence style, subsistence standard of living. And over time, they were essentially not producing, the amount of food that they needed, or the food that they did produce was essentially confiscated by the British because that was often used as a form of payment, whether through labor or just through giving them crops. So in a sense, I would say that the British government did in fact play a role in this. I know Adam Smith himself was saying that, bad agricultural seasons, these can cause, a dearth as far as food, but it's, if I'm remembering his words correctly, it's the violence of well-intentioned governments that can actually take these dearths and turn them into full-blown famines. So that's just one example that comes to my mind. I'm just kind of curious if I don't know if you're familiar with the Irish potato famine, extensively, or if you have a similar take to this.
I agree. And someone who's actually done who's written on this topic at the Institute is Mark Thornton, who it's a very similar view that you have there. And so it's always interesting. That's always one of the most popular articles every year within our archives at the Institute is his article on the potato famine. I don't know if it's probably has a very healthy search presence on Google and the like. But his work on the Irish potato famine, kind of within that revisionist tradition, is useful there. And I think this shows just how much work there is within this field. Because again, like the impact of the state within it, I mean, you can even see it kind of play out in real time during the housing crisis. Is that immediately it was the private sector was deregulation that became the de facto narrative for the housing bubble, and yet the role that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored enterprises, played was kind of brushed to the side. The role of the Federal Reserve kind of was brushed to the side. And so we've seen it play out in real time where economic crises that have devastating consequences for individuals, the immediate narrative run by with the media and the like, create a narrative that does not capture the full story of things. And you can only imagine how much more that was back then. And I think that's one of the promising aspects of modern society is that the way the ability to control that narrative is a lot harder now because of alternative media, because of the ability for individuals to read either heterodox scholars or just very intelligent autodidactic individuals on places like Twitter or Substacks and like. We're seeing it right now. General consensus has long been one of the most powerful tools the state has had to push its agenda. You brought up 9/11 earlier. It was the mainstream media that was used to help whip America into a war frenzy, capitalizing on 9/11 to justify the war on terror broadly and the invasion of Iraq and the like. And yet now you see it much harder to create a unified narrative when, if it comes to Russia and Ukraine, if it comes to COVID, if it comes to other national scale crises. The breakdown of a sort of the state's control on the narrative through the corporate media apparatus, I think is a very strong positive for those skeptical of the regime's agenda, because ultimately it's if you control the narrative, you can control the people. That relies upon people kind of all drinking from the same trough. Where they get their information, that's a lot less available now than it has been in the past. And I think that is one of the reasons for optimism going forward.
Excellent. Yes, yes. And as far as historical matters, I do know as well that you seem to speak often about Jacksonianism, this idea of Jacksonian democracy. And I'm kind of curious, a democracy, as you know, among anarcho-capitalists such as myself, particularly Hoppians, they do tend to see democracy as a very dirty word. So basically, what is the significance of Jacksonian democracy or Andrew Jackson's ideas, and why should why should people study that or understand it very thoroughly?
Well, one of the things I've recognized of late is that when people are searching for political ideas, political solutions to these very trying times, you have a lot of Americans that look to like European history to try to capture wisdom there in a variety of ways. And I think there's some very profound differences between the American political tradition and the European tradition that are, it's kind of difficult, I think, to kind of transplant. Okay, well, this, Victorian era, English thinker had this, so there's this, so therefore, there's some immediate value in terms of navigating politics here. I'm not gonna say you can't learn, obviously, from great from scholars from outside of America. Obviously, Ludwig von Mises, very much a product of the Habsburg Empire of his youth. But I think the Jacksonian tradition is interesting, where it is baked within the American soil. And I think one of the misconceptions that people have with Jacksonian democracy is the idea that it was kind of the Jacksonians that were pushing for the expansion of the franchise, where the expansion of the franchise was happening kind of independent of Jackson's political success. So what I find interesting is that the success of Andrew Jackson was a response to changing political tides, and a response that had, I think, very positive developments for the American political process. And of course, the cornerstone of the Jacksonian agenda was that hostility to, at the time, the second bank in the United States, but very much kind of the same sort of monster that we have right now. It was the power of the central bank. It was the corruptive aspect that it had on politically privileged corporations around them. And the Jacksonians were a radically free market, proto-Austrian political movement that had political success. And so as someone who is interested in the politics of money, who is interested in sort of liberal revolution, then, I find this period of time particularly interesting, trying to understand now, obviously, what worked in, the 1820s, how it works today. There's a lot of, we're dealing with, 200 plus years in between. So you can't just kind of, can't do entirely the same. But I think there's a lot of value there. And I think that if you read Jacksonian thinkers broadly, so again, Jackson was the figurehead, he was the indispensable man. He was really a populist leader. He was an American hero after the Battle of New Orleans. I mean, he was, people were writing, pop songs, so the equivalent of at the times, Hunters of Kentucky and the like, singing his praises. And thankfully, he was a man who shared that sort of skepticism of centralized power, a skepticism of the financial elites, a skepticism of corruption. And so, and so the Jacksonian project in general, you had all sorts of fascinating figures around Jackson that are often ignored. Martin Van Buren, obviously becoming president afterwards, he gets a lot more credit than others. He was a brilliant tactician in his own right. And I think in many ways, he was kind of the heart and soul of the Jacksonian movement from a political perspective, even more than Jackson, just with the way that he was able to strategize and organize. But you had a lot of great, fascinating economic thinkers. You had William Leggett, who was a newspaper editor. You had William Gouge, who wrote very interesting treatises on the consequences of, at the time, paper money was their biggest issue. Kind of now, today, it's digital money, but there's some overlap there. And so I think if you're looking for, how can a political movement centered around attacking the government control over money and banking can be successful, well, here's a period of time, here was something that was successful. And they were successful in part because, they had real ideas, they had intelligent economic thinkers popularizing these ideas to the masses, again, writing and controlling newspaper apparatuses. This was kind of the creation of early political parties. And so the political parties, one of their missions was to educate their voters. So you come in because you like old Hickory, and you want to volunteer for Mr. Jackson, and then they explain, like, well, this is the platform, this is why we have these views. This educational aspect was a big part of that. They understood the industries that were hurting because of the corruption of the financial, because of the corruption of the economy, and they made common cause with those who could benefit from eliminating these privileges. You had very strong moral arguments, which I think this is one of the things that's undermined capitalism, is that a lot of its defenders end up retreating to very materialistic defenses of, we got cheaper stuff, we got more abundant stuff. All of these things are very important. Do not get me wrong. And I'm skeptical of anyone who dismisses the value that cheaper goods has. I mean, it's someone who has never been in economic hardship in their own right. But they were also able to make strong moral arguments, making Christian appeals to the corruptive aspects of money and banking. And so I think there's a lot of value to have from that. So I've got about 14 books on Andrew Jackson and various aspects of society that I'm working through right now. Again, trying to extract wisdom from this period of time where the powers of liberty were successful over the powers of power. I think there's value, and there's a tremendous value from history itself. And I think in particular, from someone that shares our ideological bent, there's a lot of value to have from this particular point of history, where a movement is far more closely aligned with, I think, some of the views that we have than many other aspects out there. And so it's I think a fascinating historical playground to play into. I'm going to continue to try to build up. I want to kind of create a new Jacksonian framework from my understanding of the past and my understanding of contemporary politics. But that's why I'm a big fan of this Jacksonian period. And Patrick Newman as well, in his book Cronyism, I think touches on some of the lessons that I think he kind of shares my view on this. And so there's some nice convenient overlap with his work, and I think also with Murray Rothbard, who had a very high respect for Martin Van Buren in particular, and who wrote about this period a great deal within his histories of American banking and finance in American history.
Very good, very good. I'm hearing what you're saying about Andrew Jackson here, and I'm almost seeing some parallels, between Andrew Jackson, being seen as this common man's president, and in a more modern sense, Donald Trump, for example. Now, in Donald Trump's case as the common man's president, I do think that could be considered more of a facade than it is necessarily in Jackson's case. So I'm kind of curious what your take is on Donald Trump, as some type of neo-Jackson type of figure, or how the movement associated with him would compare to what you've laid out here as as Jacksonian democracy.
I think there are definitely some parallels. Steve Bannon in particular has sort of leaned into that, and of course Trump had a portrait of Jackson in the Oval Office with him, and so I think very much having that sort of rock star celebrity sort of figure, there is some overlap there. I think the biggest difference, but Jackson was a lot more effective at wielding power, which is to Trump's discredit. He was also surrounded by people that had a very serious political worldview that they were trying to implement with the power that Jackson had. Whereas I think Trump, I think Steve Bannon, while there's plenty of areas where I disagree with him, I think he's a serious thinker. I think he had a very ambitious sort of worldview that he was fighting for. I think a lot of the people in modern politics that Trump's issue is that he was very easy he continues to be very easy to flatter. Whereas Jackson was much more, I think, a man of principle. He kind of very much had a sort of that kind of a great early, Scotch American or Scotch Irish sort of, hardiness to him. And so Jackson surrounded himself with people that shared his ideas. Trump surrounded himself with people that flattered Trump. And so you kind of had a rush to the bottom of, who could kiss his butt the best. And you end up having very talented people on the outs of that, because they're kind of lows that people around him would go to that they wouldn't. And so he ended up having a lot of the kind of the old swamp crowd that were willing to kind of play that game because they're desperate to maintain power for the sake of maintaining power. And so I think what you need is a similar sort of populist figure that can have that sort of Trump style impact, but is surrounded by people who really have an agenda, who are committed to substantive ideas. And maybe if he ends up winning again, maybe I think he would have better people around him, in part just because of kind of a self-filtering mechanism. And I think his Trump's attacks on the credibility of elections, which I think are extremely valid. I do think the 2020 election was had many of the issues there. That I think he's driven away a lot of the worst people around him because of that. You have institutions that have been built in the current era to kind of help with the hiring side of things. Conservative Partners is one, which I've had some friends in that take issues seriously. I'm not going to say that they're fully Rothbardian libertarian, but they've got some credible people there. Heritage Foundation has taken some major steps in the right direction. They've changed in foreign policy a good amount. They have a lot of Austrian economists working within their orbit right now. So if typically you have like in the Heritage Foundation ends up filing in for Republican administrative jobs when you have a new when you have a Republican president. So there might be an uptick there in quality and the like. And I also think Trump's kind of anger over prosecution might pay out some dividends when it comes to the deep state and things like that. So I'm not ruling out any hope that a potential Trump 2.0 won't be better than Trump 1.0. But I think ultimately Trump has some weaknesses that for Jackson, who had plenty of plenty of areas to disagree with Jackson himself. I think Jackson was motivated by more than his own vanity, and I think that's definitely something that very much fuels Trump. And so it requires people around him to navigate those in ways that you didn't have to quite do with Jackson. But I think ultimately, given how broken the system is, given that we have this democratic system, like it or not, that America has, in order to have meaningful political success, it's going to require a Trump-like figure that is interested in promoting a solid agenda. And that's why, again, I think the Javier Milei example in Argentina is very fascinating, because he is kind of a combination. If I were to pull two people that he reminds me of, it's kind of a mix of Trump and Peter Schiff. He was an economic commentator, kind of doing a Peter Schiff sort of thing, decrying the state of the Argentinian economy. And then he became this sort of right-wing bomb thrower, not giving up those ideas, but kind of leaning into a similar sort of aesthetic that Trump has. And now you're seeing him as, again, the overwhelming favorite for that political office. So, a Javier Milei for America, I think ultimately would be necessary for making the big changes that we need. But again, I think even there, there's some parallels between that and kind of a Jacksonian figure.
I'm glad you bring up Javier Milei. I was thinking to myself, about the parallels between Jackson and Trump, as well as the parallels between Jackson and Milei. And my theory behind the success of somebody like Javier Milei in Argentina, whereas at a different point in history this might not have been seen as a realistic option, but personally I'm thinking of this as something where the Argentine peso, for example, I know recently was below 1/3 of a penny in U.S. dollars, which was actually the all-time low, if I'm not mistaken, historically. And I personally see that, as Argentina is in a very bad economic predicament. We've seen this over the past, 70 or so years. We've seen figures such as Juan Perón, who established more of a corporatist society. And, we've seen the economy basically slowly but steadily collapse. And I see Argentina in a position where its back is really up against the wall. So they're really in a position now where they really can't afford to use any more of this kind of wishy-washy communist rhetoric. It kind of calls to mind a quote by George Orwell along the lines of, maybe in philosophy or economics or philosophy or ethics or religion or art, 2 and 2 can make 5. But when it comes to building a plane or designing a gun, they have to make 4. So it's like we can't really, since the chips are really down and Argentina's in a position where they can't really afford to let, their economic situation get any worse. That's why they have to take a more practical decision and turn to, ideas such as the ones that Milei is promoting. I see those as fundamentally rooted in reality. So basically, just wrapping up what we're talking about here, what do you think then of the idea that Austrian economics is more deeply rooted in reality, and that's why we're seeing, Argentina hopefully as the start of a global trend in more of in going in this type of direction?
Well, I certainly think Austrian economics is far more rooted in reality, but I don't think that political crises necessarily means the rise of Austrian figures. I think it leads to the rise of broadening the spectrum of possibilities. And I think Argentina is just extremely lucky that they have someone of the political skill set, the stature in society, right? You know, Javier Milei is a successful man. He's a respected man. And he's got the energy. He's got, you know, he's got a powerful enough set of skills that he can make himself a credible candidate, that he can take this time of crises and use it to advocate for real viable solutions guided by a worldview more grounded in reality than most. And the public is desperate enough to try something as radical as libertarianism. It's like libertarianism is a radical philosophy in the modern world.
Unfortunately.
And so you know, you have a country that is desperate enough to seek a radical solution, and you have someone who is in a position to advocate for that radical solution. And now the exciting thing is that if Milei is successful, and if the livelihoods of Argentinians are better off as a result of his governance, then that makes it far easier for other world leaders, particularly in South America, to point to the Argentina model and said, you know, they don't have to be as well versed in Austrian economics as Milei is, to say what Milei is doing in Argentina is what I want to do here. We kind of see this already with Bukele in El Salvador. You know, has advocated for Bitcoinization, has a very fascinating political figure. You know, he has brought homicide rates down to a very low level, and his success has made him extremely popular political figure. Now every center-right candidate is pointing to Bukele and saying, well, I want to do what Bukele is doing here. We're living in such a clown world where I don't think there's any nation out there where you see overwhelming confidence in the quality of their government. You know, when you start, if we can have just a single example of a successful Austro-libertarian political leader, then the opportunity for that to spread and to become a model that others emulate, that people learn from, I think is very promising. And I think that can help spark a global revolution. Not a universal one, but where you have more and more political parties, political leaders willing to follow that model. And so again, it requires, I think, success, taking it from theory to the practical. And so we're very lucky that you have a man like Javier Milei who's in that position to do so. And I wish him the best of luck. And I think that what we're seeing in South America in general, you have a wonderful class of Spanish language economists that are Austrian. You know, you have great institutions there. You have University of Francisco de Marquín in Guatemala that has an explicitly Austrian program. You have Horacio de Soto is a Spanish economist in Madrid that has had a number of students come through. And so I would reckon that the percentage of respected economists in Spanish language countries that are Austrian is a higher percentage than you have in America. And so therefore you have, you know, you have a lot more chances for these ideas impacting people in political positions. And so I think South America has a lot of things going in its favor. You know, that could change very quickly, right? The Brazilian election with Lula's victory there, I think, was a defeat for the anti-communist cause in the continent. But if Milei is able to win, if he's successful at making the lives of Argentinians better, then it would not at all surprise me to see Milei inspired candidates have success elsewhere, and I think that would be a very good thing.
Yes, very good. I hope that Milei, you know, essentially proves to be the spark that starts essentially a bonfire of libertarian ideas, you know, around, you know, not just, you know, Argentina, but South America and the rest of the world as well. So on that note, I do want to, you know, thank you very much for coming on, Tho. I think we've had a very good discussion here, and anybody listening in, certainly make sure to check out the Mises Institute. You know, they have a very wide library of texts by Austro-libertarian thinkers, many of them accessible for free, actually. So much for the profit, hungry, capitalist there. At the end of the day, it comes down to truly, spreading a message and, making the world a better place. And I'm very happy that, this is what the Mises Institute is devoted to. So with that said, though, I just want to give you many thanks for appearing on the show. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. This has been Morgan Meets the Eye. So make sure to follow Tho Bishop and myself on social media, subscribe, comment, and above all, keep asking why. Everybody out there, have a good one. Bye-bye.